everyone, it's Sevi. Over the past several versions I've been making Genshin videos for, I've had this growing sentiment of how they don't make them like they used to. In this case, they refers to Hoyoverse or Mihoyo, and them refers to the 4-star characters in Genshin Impact. And I think some of you players who have been around since the game's early release might be thinking similarly. Now, I don't mean in terms of personality or voice acting or aesthetics, because Hoyo has been keeping up their A-game so far in these regards. But rather, this discussion revolves around the unit's meta value and relative power level, because it seems that moving forward, we have to start adjusting, or more bluntly, lowering our expectations of 4-star characters because of how the trend looks. So in this video, I'd like to share some of my thoughts on how and why Genshin Impact's 4-star characters are getting quote-unquote worse. If I had to choose who I think the best 4-star characters are, there would be no question that they'd come from the original batch all the way from Genshin's very early release. Fischl has her incredible single target damage and is the benchmark for being an electro battery. Bennett has his busted attack buff plus healing combo and battery utility. Xingqiu has amazing off-field hydro damage and application, who was so good that when Hoyo released a 5-star version of him that did almost the same thing, everyone was still so thankful. Sucrose is an amazing buffer, swirler, and crowd controller who is treated as a peer of 5-stars Kazuha and Venti. And Xiangling, well, it's Xiangling who defined a standard for pyro DPSs, still competing even with 5-stars. And of course, a few more others. These are very popular examples and indisputably top meta units that you cannot go wrong with investing in. And to say that they are broken is not an exaggeration. Individually, they're amazing, and together they have made up the core members of powerful team templates, making them very difficult or even impossible to find an alternative for. Granted, not every character from the early release days is mind-blowing, but the fact remains that a good enough number of them are still insanely good then and now. It's almost unbelievable. Take the national team, whose core is Bennett, Xingqiu, and Xiangling, an all 4-star combo. This team's reputation is unquestionable for being insanely good at both single and multi-target damage. It's gone through different variations, but these three remain as its core options. It will carry you through the hardest content in a way that combos of newer 4-stars can't even match up to yet. Fischl and Sucrose are also great examples of individual characters that have never dwindled in strength ever since the start of the game. Even with some attempts to introduce alternatives, they have proved as valuable as ever. On the contrary, they just keep aging better, more so now with Dendro teams. We have these originals that have set such a high bar, and whose value has either remained consistent or grown over the course of many updates. So when the Inazuma version was about to close, there was a sort of consensus upon looking back at the 4-stars released within it that they haven't really received the same level of praise for their relevance and consistency. And frankly, I'm also wary that what we'll get in the Sumeru patch may end up feeling the same. The latest additions, Collei and Dori, have only served to reinforce that sentiment. Collei is a free character, and so by virtue of being one, she's given a sort of pass. But unfortunately for Collei, Dendro Traveler is also free, and actually an amazing Dendro support who is a more synergistic choice for many other Dendro teams at the moment. Dori, however, is even stranger. She fills an electro healer role that not long ago has already been addressed by Kuki Shinobu, and I would say Dori has more pronounced drawbacks. So why introduce Dori this soon, who feels a bit redundant, when she could have had an entirely different kit that would make her stand out more? Our last 4-star before 3.0 was Heizo, and while I saw him as one of the more fun and useful characters added to the roster, I can't say that he's an overall invaluable of a unit as Sucrose. The way I see it, two things are happening and will continue to happen with the newer 4-stars. Either they're side-graded or downgraded versions of previous 4 or 5 stars, or they're introduced to help fulfill a niche or consolidate roles that previous units didn't assume. While such units do have value, and some have even found their place in some very specific team comps, it's still a far cry from the general usefulness of the original 4-stars. So what's the deal? I've heard it said that Hoyoverse is avoiding making new 4-star characters that are as good as the original broken ones, and I kind of agree. I don't mean simply creating a carbon copy of Xiangling or Bennett, having a different element and overlapping skill sets, although honestly that wouldn't be so bad. But just in general, characters, whatever element or kit, that can output a similarly impressive level of damage or support utility without pronounced drawbacks. When these OG Meta 4-stars were designed and released, I don't know if anyone, whether from MiHoYo or the player base itself, anticipated how powerful they would be in the long game. At the start, it was too early to comprehensively gauge power level yet. More units, weapons, and artifacts were on the way, we were missing the Dendro element, and it took a while to fully build teams and characters to realize their full potential. Still, these characters would set the standard and precedent for future comparisons. But I don't even know if the game designers knew just how busted the characters they created were. Did they realize that the national team would be such a broken team? Did they even imagine such a team comp would exist to be so popular in the first place? Were they thinking so far ahead that they knew Fischl would become even more busted when Dendro arrives? Or was that just an incidental result of Electro being generally buffed by Dendro? If I could interview someone from there, I would have a lot of questions. It didn't help either that, back then, there was a lot of discussion being thrown around about power creeping. The idea that newer units are going to slowly get better than older ones in order to incentivize pulling them. And so I feel like for the general player base, this created the expectation and apprehension that subsequent characters will be stronger, or at the very least stay on the same level. But so far, at least with 4 stars, neither of those came true. It also seems they're dialing back on certain mechanics that contribute to how broken older characters were. For example, Xiangling's burst had no ICD, which made her reverse vaporize damage busted. Then standard ICDs for Inazuma 4 stars became the norm, which was understandable. But now we're starting to see more special ICDs, but not necessarily for the better, like with Collei and Dori, which might also hold true for future characters to prevent them from being potentially broken. So why are we getting units that feel worse? Why not make 4 stars that match the level that the originals were on? Well, one potential reason is that if they keep making 4 stars that are too good, there will be less and less reason to pull for 5 stars. Of course, this isn't an issue for simping and waifu over meta players, but there's undeniably people who also care about the functional value of what they're getting relative to other options, and that's perfectly understandable. Since Hoyoverse's entire business model is built on getting players to pull for characters, they'd probably need to maintain good incentives to pull for limited 5-star character banners. And of course, one such incentive would be that they are significant power upgrades to 4 stars. There are notable original 4 stars that could compete with 5-star characters, and that made the gap between them smaller or almost non-existent. Even now, debates between Xiangling, Hu Tao, and Yoimiya would still arise because some can't help making that comparison. I think that this isn't a testament to how bad the 5 stars are, but just how Xiangling, a free 4-star unit from version 1.0, is so broken that she can go toe-to-toe with 5-star pyro DPSs. If such broken units existed in other competitive PvP games, they might have been nerfed in succeeding updates to avoid being abused. But this isn't a competitive game, and obviously Hoyoverse can't nerf these first 4-star characters directly. That would just be plain unfair, and it would draw the ire of players. At some point, Hoyoverse probably realized that their first set of 4-star characters were too strong, and vowed never to create a 4-star as broken as them ever again. It became clear how these core 4-stars defined so much of the meta because they were pretty overpowered. They had to recalibrate their next outputs then. It left them with the option of making 4-stars that were more quote-unquote balanced. How so? By limiting their utilities with drawbacks, by making them downgrades of old 5-stars, or by introducing someone that fills in a previously unassumed role. If power creep is a thing, then Hoyo is doing the exact opposite of that with subsequent 4-star units. But even though we're getting units that attempt to introduce new or unique gameplay mechanics, it also feels like there's now more tendency to miss the mark rather than hit it. And so I, along with others I'm sure, feel a certain level of disappointment when I'm getting a new 4-star and can't help but think it's just not as good as I expected it to be. That's because it's hard to shake off the high standards set by the originals. Anything that came after would have to always walk under the OG's shadow if they can't live up to them. Another consequence of this is, as more 4-stars are added to the roster, our OG 4-stars may have wider gaps between their banner rate-ups, and therefore less opportunities to pull them. Banners will get more saturated with characters with more normalized power levels. Thankfully, some of the originals are purchasable in the Paimon's bargain shop, and I think that's a very good use of Star Glitter if you can't manage to pull them in banners. This is obviously not a problem for players that don't care about meta, and Hoyoverse is unlikely to force players into combat situations where teams using the newer 4-stars will be unable to clear, as long as they're given enough investment. But for older players whose Genshin experience was shaped by the original 4-stars, the power gap between them and the more recent 4-stars is quite evident. So moving forward, there are a couple of things I've come to expect. In relation to 5-star characters, I think Hoyo will make it so that future 5-stars will be undeniably and unmistakably much stronger than future 4-stars, who will then be perceived as more balanced or weaker depending on your point of view, but they will certainly be far from the likes of Bennett or Fischl. On the other hand, 5-stars will maintain a closer range of power level compared to previous 5-stars, which also helps keep 5-star reruns still worth pulling. In doing these things, it will reframe the perception of players, especially newer ones, that new 5-stars are more worth pulling because they're an even bigger upgrade over the 4-stars. I hate to say it, but if we keep expecting new 4-stars to be just as good as the original broken 4-stars are in terms of meta, then I believe we're going to remain in a state of perpetual disappointment. With that mindset, everything that comes after is going to be okay at best, or just plain worse in terms of their combat utility. In order to avoid that disappointment, we'd have to acknowledge that this is going to be the norm. We're not going to get another 4-star that feels as busted as Fischl or Bennett or Xiangling or Beidou or Rosaria. And if we do, it will definitely be a very, very huge exception to the rule. Or it's probably more like a 5-star unit already. It's a good route to try to introduce more unique gameplay concepts for new players instead of just rehashing already existing characters. Given that we have relatively limited gameplay control options, that seems like a big challenge, but it has to be done to keep characters fresh and fun. And I know there were attempts, though the latest one with Dori's whole Ginny electrocurrent thing, the end result wasn't as wow for me. Still, I won't stop preaching just how good certain original 4-stars are, because if you are a player who cares about which units are the most effective, if you're more deliberate about how to efficiently spend your resources, then yes, these 4-stars are just insanely good value. But that doesn't mean I'm saying that the newer 4-stars are bad to work with, since they do still find functional team comps or can find specialized roles to excel in. And I think it's worth saying again and again that this doesn't mean we should just act judgmental towards players who don't mind the meta, because personal preference is more important. And despite the comparisons I've made in this video, I also don't like telling players don't play this character because that other character is just better. This is a game about wanting to use the character you like after all. Even without these OG 4-stars, the game can still be enjoyable. On a more optimistic note, I also think that, as the roster of characters in Genshin rapidly grows, it's possible that we receive characters that are somehow more synergistic with newer 4-stars. It's a bit hard to imagine this happening, and upon their release, I prefer not to base a character's meta value on future potential. But Genshin is nowhere near finished, and neither is its character roster. So in the meantime, I'm going to manage my expectations, but I'll keep one eye open to see if this trend will indeed be the norm, or if there are better surprises in store for us. Anyway, that's going to be all for this video. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!